everybody. It's so nice for so many of you to join us for this conversation. People are just starting to come in. We're excited to have 3 amazing panelists here, industry leaders in their own right, to talk about the bio-based economy. We're continuing to let folks in for the next minute or so. But for our attendees who are joining to listen in, please use the chat to share your name and where you're calling in from and your organization. Introduce yourself. Would love to learn more about the folks that are listening in today. Cool. Great. So with that, I think I might start and kick us off. We've got a busy hour ahead of us. And Katie, on your end, you might have a bit of a bandwidth issue. Your video is a little blurry, just so you know. Side.
Okay.
Right. So I am going to get started here. Thanks, everybody. I just wanted to offer some quick introductions and housekeeping. My name is Savannah Seidel, and I am the Vice President of Sustainability for Better Earth. We are so excited that you are joining us at the end of this Earth Month for an important conversation. A little housekeeping before we begin. Feel free to use the chat and reaction icons throughout this webinar to engage with me and our panelists and ask questions. As I was just mentioning to the folks who came in, if you just came in and joined us, please hop in the chat now and introduce yourself, share your name, where you're coming from and your organization, or what you're passionate about and what you're hoping to learn from this webinar. So there will be a Q&A section at the end of this hour together, so please share your questions as well. I'll make sure to keep tabs on them and share them to our panelists at the end. So without further ado, I'll kick things off with a brief introduction to Better Earth and then pass things over to our panelists. So our compostable food service packaging is made from renewable and regenerative crops that naturally sequester carbon and enrich soil. Designed to disappear, Better Earth compostable packaging breaks down into regenerative, nutrient-rich compost that revitalizes the land to help grow more nutrient-dense crops. So from field to fork to field, what we're trying to do at Better Earth is really close the loop, which is so much of the theme of the conversation today. It's clear that these types of bio-based solutions can have a massive impact to turn the tide on today's linear and extractive economy that has led to so many environmental crises. So much so that President Biden has committed to transitioning 90% of plastic with bio-based alternatives. So with that, I'd like to turn over to the experts in the room that I am so excited to personally learn from. And together we'll learn more about what the bio-based economy is and really lean into the food service industry as a case study for this. And particularly compostable food service packaging is one of those bio-based solutions. So we'll go in the order as displayed on the screen. Katie, would love to start with you if you could introduce yourself and your organization.
Absolutely. And hopefully you can hear me and I'm not wobbly now.
Yes, I can hear you. Your video is a little fuzzy, but we can hear you perfectly.
I apologize for that high-speed internet, they say, but what do you know? Savannah, I really appreciate you welcoming me, and I'm very privileged to be alongside Clifton and Nuha on this conversation. So my name is Katie Hoffman. I am a partner at a firm called Regeneration.VC. We are investors in early stage companies across consumer industries that are addressing the climate crisis by means of biomaterials and circular economy and regenerative principles. So we look at how do we design materials so that they can stay in circulation longer and, maintain their processes within the biosphere. How do we keep existing materials in circulation that have already been produced? And how do we support the brands and mechanisms and platforms that do that? And then also, how do we reuse materials, right? Reverse logistics, systems that enable us to reprocess materials that have already potentially been destined for, say, a landfill, and how do we reimagine those processes where we can redefine waste. So yeah, I think the long and short is we're very, very excited about the opportunities presented by the bioeconomy and being able to be a part of this conversation. My background is actually in climate finance, and I spent the last 10 years trying to figure out how we integrate, what we call environmental, social, and governance standards into the highest levels of governance at institutional investors, California pension funds, and also European sovereign wealth funds. And what we have seen recently is there are tailwinds, significant tailwinds. There is a move towards this growth, right? Bioeconomy growth. And I'm excited to be at the early stages of investing and then also work with brands and companies and anyone who is trying to figure out ways to integrate these solutions into the global economy.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Katie. And with that, I'll pass things over to Nuha.
Thanks, Savannah, and it's so nice to be here. I'm Nuha. I'm co-founder and CEO of a company called Erthos. We are an early stage materials company based out of Canada, and we create plant-powered alternatives for traditional plastics that are fully compatible with existing infrastructure. They're designed to be compostable at their end of life, and they're also sustainably made with a lower carbon, energy, and water footprint. At Erthos, we strongly believe in the power of biomaterials and their ability to help us solve the plastic waste crisis. So we've been building this company for the past 5 years now. Originally started off as a research project out of the University of Toronto. Today, we're a team of 20. We operate in Canada, but also work with brands and manufacturers globally to help them integrate plant-powered materials from the very beginning of their supply chain and how we can make sure it's truly a seamless process for them. We also work with policymakers and environmental groups globally to help advocate for the overall biomaterials landscape and how we can all get one step closer to a sustainable future with biomaterials. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'd love to see female leadership in this space as well. So with that, I am going to shift over to you, Clifton.
Great, thank you, Savannah. Pleasure to be here today. Very excited and looking forward to the conversation. My name is Cliff. I'm the marketing director here at BPI. And BPI was founded in 1999 and is the leading authority on certifying compostable products in North America. And we accomplish this in a few different ways. We have a rigorous scientific standard that we use to evaluate compostable certification for the products that undergo our review process. We also work heavily with the consumer markets to educate compostable programs where products should actually go, as well as how to actually manage end-of-life scenarios for these products. And then lastly, we also have a large advocacy arm where we work heavily with government organizations to help influence and hopefully make change in expanding our compostable infrastructure. And my background for the last 12 years of my career, I've worked in various sustainability industries promoting primarily waste, energy, and circularity solutions. I've been very fortunate to work with global Fortune 1000 companies, most of our governmental organizations, as well as most of the major science-based certification programs in terms of sustainability. And personally, my greatest professional joy is just to develop thought-leading marketing and PR strategies in collaboration with others who are trying to drive climate action and spread awareness about sustainability initiatives. So, while I'm a marketer by trade, I'm extremely passionate about this space and making a positive impact on the world. I love working with the smart and talented people who are trying to change this industry every day, just like the panelists on this webinar. And I'm looking forward to today's conversation.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much, Cliff. And me too. I'm really looking forward to this as well. So we can dive into it. So with that, I think I'm going to start with you, Katie. And with that, I want to start from, foundations and go from that up. And, if you wouldn't mind, could you help walk us through some of this vocabulary? What do we mean when we say bio-based economy?
Right, it's a great question. So bioeconomy, there's a few different ways you can slice it, but anything that is derived from natural systems that are biological organisms. And at least there are many definitions, both on the structural side and different governments have different ways of defining the bioeconomy. But from our perspective, and I'll speak on behalf of Regeneration.VC and also the work that I've been doing, is materials and processes that are derived from living systems and are kept within living systems. So some people might say that petroleum is that, but we would actually argue that non-petroleum based products that have the potential to regenerate living systems are what we are looking for when we're talking about bio-based.
Right, and because there's that difference between renewable and non-renewable resources as well. While petroleum certainly came from dinosaurs many years ago, there's not much more fossil fuels left, right? It's that non-renewable resource. And so one of the reasons why we need to lean into things that can continue to replenish themselves. And, I'm curious too, going back to, Regeneration.VC's, start, y'all are really leaning into regeneration as a critical tool towards addressing the climate emergency. Could you elaborate on why y'all have put so much bets on this as such an important tool for that?
Thank you for that question, because actually your point is really well taken on renewable versus non-renewable. So we decided to start our firm, it was actually right in the beginning of the pandemic, and all of us we came together as partners and said, where are the gaps in solving the climate crisis? We know that there's going to be a big shift in energy, mobility. We're seeing so much traction in that space now, which we applaud, and many of us have put energy into. Where are the gaps? And we looked to materiality in areas that are not necessarily traditional around when it comes to the climate change crisis. It's not necessarily how do you reduce emissions, at a gigaton scale with changing transportation and changing mobility and buildings, but what about our households, the things that we touch, the way that we eat, right? And the supply chains that underpin that. And the data actually demonstrated, when Ellen MacArthur Foundation has been very rigorous in this regard, that 45% of emissions reduction potential is actually not just in the energy transition, but it's in the way that we live our lives, household consumption. And that led us down this path of, all right, well, we want to invest in areas that are underfunded right now. Less than 4% of venture capital, even in the climate tech, but just writ large, is going into consumer markets. So what we touch, what we eat, what we drink, these types of conversations. So we thought, okay, let's focus on that, and let's see where we can have transformative potential around biomaterials in those supply chains while we're going through this transition, and have a huge impact on both carbon emissions and that reduction potential, but also toxics in our water, the other kinds of concepts that I think we've left out of the climate conversation, which really relate to biodiversity, to our human health, and how we can potentially regenerate those fronts as well.
Yeah, there's something really beautiful about regeneration, because as I've continued to do my research, what I love seeing is that if we're really going to address the climate emergency, it starts with ourselves and our relationship with the planet, right? And how we can actually regenerate all systems. And Paul Hawken, the leading climate writer and solutions architect, his second volume is literally called Regeneration, because he believes that it so strongly can help us get from A to B. So thank you so much for walking us through that and y'all's point of view. With that, Cliff, I might shift over to you because I'd like to talk about some of these household solutions, right? And exactly as Katie was talking about, that was really poignant about how much emissions we can really address from that household perspective. And as you and I are both aware, the food service industry has been a historically wasteful one and is ripe for opportunity and innovation. And BPI really sits at the helm of that in representing an industry that's trying to shift over from that linear and extractive economy to a circular and regenerative one. So I was wondering if you could walk us through how compostable packaging is contributing to a closed loop cycle and the benefits that it offers through the value chain.
Absolutely, yeah. Compostable packaging absolutely has a role to play in a circular economy and many closed loop systems. But like most sustainable practices, it's not a silver bullet for plastic contamination. I think most of us on this call know that it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of different solutions to tackle the climate crisis. So really, BPI, even though we're the leading North America certifier on compostable products, we're still a big supporter on doing what you can to reduce the waste that we're individually producing as individuals and organizations for what we can. But with that said, compostable packaging is definitely one of the multiple solutions needed to prevent waste, to recirculate materials, and regenerate our nature. Really, so it's best suited for certain scenarios, things like food and drink applications, really where it can help increase the organic waste collected so that it does not go to a landfill and produce that harmful methane that we've been talking about. Ultimately, compostability is really a small part of the overall packaging solution, but it is suited for very specific high value use cases like items that are not recyclable or non-reusable products. And really, like we talked about, food associated applications. And as food is really one of the biggest top materials consistently sent to landfills in the US and really one of the most least understood, as Katie had mentioned, for most consumers and households, compostables are really a great fit for that circular economy and those closed loop systems where we're trying to return nutrients to the soil and contribute to regenerative soils and building healthy food systems. So really, take a festival or a sports event, for example. Using compostable packaging at those events means that all that uneaten food or food scraps can be thrown into a single bin for processing, which allows the nutrients to be preserved without contaminating the waste stream. And that allows for increased diversion and a lot of food scraps and single-use packaging to go away from landfills and to be diverted to facilities that can actually process that matter into compost, kind of closing that loop on the everything from the resin production all the way down to the actual composting of the end product. And BPI, we're in a unique position where because we're a nonprofit, we work really with all of the members of the compostable value chain. We work with resin producers, manufacturers, distributors, the municipalities, and all the other NGOs and composters to collaborate and really develop the industry standards and best practices to keep moving this forward. So really for our value chain stakeholders, compostable packaging allows manufacturers and major brands to not only work towards creating more sustainable operations and closed loop systems, which I think we all agree is a much needed transition in today's society, but it also allows for increased food diversion rates for events in municipalities, which increases that food collection for composters. So it really has a lot of different benefits for the various stakeholders in our value chain.
Absolutely. And, you were hitting on all those key stakeholders, right, who are part of this system. And that's what I love about regenerative solutions is that nothing is isolated, right? Within a linear economy, things are, over here and over there, and that's caused a lot of the messes. But within a regenerative economy, it's more of a value chain than a strictly a supply chain, right? Everyone's partners in the process and in its success. And so, it's all about partners working together, and y'all really represent represent a glue, in this hub and spoke model of bringing everybody together. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit further. You had briefly touched on it, but what are some of the bottlenecks that BPI is helping to work through to help make this system as successful as possible? Nothing's perfect, and it's continuing to grow. So what is that looking like for you right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. Our industry may not be as developed or robust as things like renewable energy or those kind of industries, but really the most pressing bottleneck for compostable packaging is our infrastructure. For our certified compostable products, these need to go to a commercial compost facility that is set up to handle compostable packaging, right? And not all composters are operating in a manner that can address compostable packaging. And the ones that are equipped to handle compostable packaging are not available to all households within the United States. So really, one of the biggest bottlenecks in our position is we need to increase the diversion rate of organics from landfill with increased infrastructure. So industrial composting facilities need to be scaled globally over the next coming years, really to capture and circulate this organic material, many of which is collected from compostable food packaging. So really, we really need that global investment in the infrastructure, which is composting processing facilities, haulers, and we really just need to make sure that the logistics and economics of that work, because really most households don't have access to those facilities right now. So to address this bottleneck, BPI has a comprehensive government advocacy program, which we talked about earlier. Our advocacy team really works heavily to draft, support, and testify in favor of compostable infrastructure, like the Recycling and Compost Accountability Act. Contamination is also probably the other biggest bottleneck that we're currently experiencing. Contamination, what we're referring to there is contamination occurs when composters receive too many products that are not compostable. And this really happens because there's a combination of lack of education, lack of understanding labeling and screening between haulers, customers, and the compost facility. So one of the things that's really driving that is consumer awareness around how to properly recycle or compost an item is really not widespread. Most consumers do not know where to put their compostable products. They still place those in, or they place they replace recyclable and non-compostable products in their compost bin. And in collaboration with closed loop partners, we recently conducted research and we found out that at least 28% of respondents are still placing compostable packaging in the recycling bin as well. So there's still a lot of work to do on educating consumers on where products should go at the end of the life. And that's another reason why these solutions are so great in closed loop systems, because that diversion can be controlled. And in that same research I just talked about, we found that consumers need at least 2 to 3 labeling elements that indicate the product is compostable for it actually to be effective for them to know where to put it. So really, again, to address this bottleneck, BPI has released labeling guidelines. We're updating our labeling guidelines based on the findings of the research we just discussed, which will also be released publicly later this year. And again, we also work with all of our member partners, ranging from the full value chain to make sure everybody is coming together to really collaborate on this solution and how we can drive the industry forward.
I appreciate that summary, Cliff. Thank you. And, I am personally so excited about the momentum that we're seeing in growing composting infrastructure. We're at a nice tipping point of interest and awareness and education and data. I mean, that's such important data that y'all were able to collect around closed loop partners. And so kind of expanding upon that, for those who aren't familiar with the Recycling and Composting Accountability Act, at a national scale, it would finally give us that report card that we need around our recycling and composting infrastructure. It's crazy that we don't already have that. So it would finally give us that foundation to really understand where to move forward and improve. So thank you, Cliff, for that summary. With that, Nuha, I'll shift over to you. You are one of the bio-based solutions that are at our disposal. And I'd love to learn a little bit more about it. So, in your own words, I was wondering if you could elaborate on why it's so important for, we're leaning into food service industry, right, as this case study, why you think it's so important for the food service industry to be shifting over to bio-based solutions like y'all's.
For sure. And I think Clifton obviously touched on a few of those key reasons, but when we think about building materials for a lot of different applications in our space, we always look at the packaging purpose and then also the end of life. So first of all, when it comes to the actual packaging purpose, if it's a single or limited use case, if we know it's something that's disposed of very quickly, if we know that it's typically food contaminated, which it always is in the food service space. And then also the third element that we look at is the shape, the size, the form factor of a lot of packaging and plastics within this space too. We know that those are a lot of the reasons why things are difficult to recycle or hard to recycle is, those small little ice cream spoons that always end up getting lost in our streams. And so I think that there's obviously a lot of those core reasons that drive us to building materials specifically for the food service industry, because it's such a great way for us to actually effectively capture and turn that material into something that's more valuable. And then on the end of life aspect of it, I think it's always important to think about where the current plastics or packaging materials within the food service space are realistically ending up. And unfortunately, they aren't being recycled effectively. And so what we're comparing against is landfill. And if we think about biomaterials holistically, aside from the fact that they can be composted and they have a really great end of life, they also are sustainable from a source perspective. So making sure that the material itself has lower carbon footprint, energy, water. And so there's so many ways that we can ensure that the overall solution in the biomaterial space can really add value on multiple fronts.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I appreciate that comprehensive perspective because that's what we need. I mean, we're talking in systems here, right? And I'd love if you could elaborate a little bit further around, so what are the types of products that y'all offer? Could you paint us a picture of that too?
Definitely. So we focus on the inputs themselves. So anything currently used in the plastic space like polypropylene or polystyrene. So we design materials that are one-for-one alternatives to those type of products. So if you take polypropylene, which is one of our first commercially available resins, it's designed for injection molding applications. So think, tableware, food containers, a lot of use cases within the food service space. And polypropylene or, the materials we design are also alternatives for a lot of the mixed plastic applications, which again are very difficult to recycle and not effectively captured today. So that's where we focus our efforts in on, is standardizing the input material in the bio-based space.
Gotcha. So you're offering bio-based alternatives to those traditional plastic resins. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, exactly.
Awesome. And so with that, there has been a lot of talk in the space around bioplastics in general. And bioplastics is, for those that are listening in, it's a very generic term too. So there can be a lot there. I was wondering if you could unpack some of the misconceptions around bioplastics, because it definitely is a pretty confusing space when someone's navigating it.
Yeah, there's so many misconceptions. Where can I even start? I think that obviously a lot of my job and our team's job is also doing a lot of that myth busting, and it's actually pretty fun sometimes. But I think that there's a few. Obviously, there's that assumption that bio-based or compostable materials or packaging isn't as circular as something like recycling, because it's not a traditional cycle. And I think that obviously, that isn't the case. I think that recycling and composting can coexist and add a lot of value to the overall circular economy, and that's really important to remember. And the other thing that I would mention, just because we're on this call, is the consumer awareness around composting versus recycling and how effective composting is compared to recycling. So I think we're always trying to compare these two. And although I think that there's still a lot of work to be done, as Clifton mentioned, just around labeling and messaging and the overall consumer awareness, I don't necessarily think that consumers are unaware of composting, especially here in North America. And I also don't think that consumers fully understand how to effectively recycle either, given the vast amount of products out there and the different resin codes and everything else. And so I think that, when we look at Canada, for example, we have a 9% recycling rate, and we also have a 41% commercial composting rate. And so I think that that obviously is significant in the sense that consumers are willing to support the composting infrastructure growth. And if we can give bioplastics and bio-based materials the same effort, resources, investment as we did recycling, which was decades old, who knows what value can really bring to this economy. So I think that that's one that I always like to myth bust.
Yes, and there's so much wish cycling out there. And if folks have not yet seen John Oliver's deep dive into the issues around recycling, I cannot recommend it enough. It was so well done, and highlights a lot of the pain points within that system. And so in this topic of innovations, Katie, I'd like to pass things back over to you. So within Regeneration.VC, y'all are constantly seeing new things in the market that fit this bill, that are really turning the tide. And just kind of, I was curious if you could elaborate on some of the exciting innovations that you are seeing in the regenerative economy space, particularly related to packaging or materials.
Definitely. And what an exciting conversation, because I feel like we're hitting the design, use, and reuse components, and everyone is an expert in different components of that. And I couldn't agree more that infrastructure is needed and it needs to shift. I'm really excited by the policies that have recently been passed, by the Biden administration on biomanufacturing and biomaterials, and I think that there is going to be big strides. So that's just responding to the other panelists. And to your question, so we have seen a ton of innovation. We've, as an early stage fund in a space that isn't exactly carved out in venture, we're not exactly climate tech, but we are, right? We're focused on that, but we're really focused on, bioeconomy, biodiversity, circularity, and doing that within consumer markets, which is already underrepresented within early stage investment. We've seen over 5,500 deals in the last 18 months in different categories that, and this is everything from biomaterials, biopolymers, solutions across the board, right? And we have very much looked at, okay, what are the solutions that can get to scale within the existing infrastructure that we have? So for example, we just made an investment in a company that is able to synthesize from a closed loop biochar system an alternative to carbon black that's non-toxic and actually compostable, and uses FSC waste product to go into that pyrolysis system. And pyrolysis is actually not the best form of waste to value all the time, but this system, which is actually based in Georgia, Savannah, you would appreciate maybe having a look at it. But we did our deep diligence in there, and they've really created a closed loop system. And that is a, $20 billion market right now. Carbon black is one of the most toxic byproducts and particulates that is in existence. So having a bio-based alternative that's coming from a waste stream is something we were very excited about, and see that scaling across different industries. Right now, they have been very prominent in apparel. We've also seen, we invested in a company that uses microorganisms to have biosynthetic microorganisms to disrupt the dyeing industry, which is one of the most noxious industries, within apparel, but also in several other consumer industries. And we're talking non-toxic, able to actually, meet material specifications that brands need, which is part of the challenge, right? And we would love to slow fast fashion, but at this current rate, it is better to start getting some of these alternatives into the H&M infrastructures of the world, so that we don't have toxic dyes, and that affects large supply chains. But the beautiful thing about even, and I'm more of a let's change the whole system, right? So affecting one dye, and that process isn't the only piece of the solution. However, the biomanufacturing capacity that enables that dyeing to take place and those microorganisms to take root is what we're really focused on, is how we scale that infrastructure, because it's going to have vast applications beyond apparel and fashion. And that's what we're really excited about and what we've focused our portfolio on.
That's awesome. That's fascinating. And yeah, I know that y'all have eyes and ears to a variety of different solutions. Some of the materials that really excite me as it relates to the packaging industry more specifically is beginning to lean into things like mycelium and mushrooms as a future material for bioplastics, seaweeds and algae. It's really, really exciting to see the variety within the space and what we'll continue to find over the next 5 to 10 years. As part of this conversation around how we build the bio-based economy, there's many different facets to it, right? There's the innovation itself. So all the different things that we've been talking about. There's the infrastructure to support it. And then I also feel another critical aspect of it in order to scale is legislation, smart legislation that helps catalyze it. And so I was thinking, maybe we could all go across, if there's anything that we haven't touched on, around some key legislation that is either just recently passed or is on the horizon that is helping catalyze the bio-based economy. Katie, would you want to kick things off around any that excite you?
Definitely. Obviously, I think everyone is hopefully a fan of the IRA, and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is also quite lovely in terms of how we can distribute climate solutions in parts of the United States and provide states with some backbone and federal support to enable some of the infrastructure that's needed to make this transition. In relation specifically to this conversation on the bio-based economy, I am so excited that there has been legislation from the Biden administration around biomanufacturing and the bioeconomy. So there was an executive order, it was 14081, I believe, and that was in 2022, which is focused on allocating more resources from the federal government across agencies to enable biomanufacturing, which will hopefully send a signal to the states and provide resources necessary. I'm also, I'm talking a lot about the US, and I'll end here, but the EU and their Green New Deal and what has been going on in that region is incredibly inspiring. And there are so many folks innovating that have resources and collaborative support that I think we can take and learn from and build collaboratively alongside.
Yes, definitely. And Cliff, I'll head over to you next. Any points of legislation that have either passed or in the pipeline that excite you around catalyzing the bio-based economy?
Absolutely, yeah. The Compost Act was actually reintroduced this year in February, which we're really excited about. And really that act incentivizes, encourages farmers and infrastructure to support food collection and food waste programs for compost and achieve additional zero food waste initiatives. So we're very excited about the Compost Act. Our advocacy team has supported that for a long time. I can't remember which year it was originally introduced, but it was reintroduced this year. So we're very excited about that one.
Yeah, that's a great one. And hopefully there could even be opportunities for the Compost Act to be folded into the Farm Bill, which is also being explored this year. So lots of opportunities there, and love that it's getting additional attention. Nuha, I know that there's a lot going on in your neck of the woods in Canada. So curious for your perspective as well.
Yeah, I think, obviously Canada was one of the first to release their single-use plastic bans, and then now we're watching as they release guidelines on how to actually integrate biomaterials and paper-based products and so on. So there's obviously a lot going on there. But the one that I'm actually most excited about, or the region that I'm excited about, is actually Asia. So I think that we're seeing a lot of really interesting innovation and guidelines and roadmaps being developed in Asia to handle waste plastic waste specifically. And we've seen the countries in those regions actually take leadership around building guidelines from scratch, which is really amazing. So one that I'll highlight is Japan. They released an entire roadmap on how they plan on incorporating biomaterials and bioplastics into their economy. And I think that that is such a great example for the rest of the world, because it's not enough to just release, a ban or a policy. I think it really does have to come with very in-depth guidelines around the challenges, the science behind it, the data-driven approaches that they're taking. So that's one that's exciting to me. And generally, Asia and their movement towards a bio-based economy is what's exciting for us too, given how many manufacturers and brands that we work with that are global, not just within North America.
Definitely, definitely. And, one that I would add in as well on the United States front is extended producer responsibility. This is something that for a long time was a bit of a fairy tale in a way in the United States, this idea of producers. So these are, brand product manufacturers helping contribute towards material recovery. This is, I think, something that's going to be a very powerful tool and vehicle towards addressing a lot of the big things that we discussed during this time together, largely with infrastructure. And we finally have seen 2 states that are really presenting a compost-friendly type of legislation. I think it was California and Colorado. Who are ensuring that, when compostable packaging is presented into that market, that money is going towards helping grow and expand composting infrastructure alongside plastics towards recycling. So we're continuing to see EPR, as it's known for short, across the United States, and several bills were introduced. I want to say 11 across the country. A few have been stalled out, but the momentum is still there and continuing. This is not something that's going away, but really going to continue on a state-by-state basis. So one more that I'm excited about. And then reminder to our guests who are joining in, please type questions into the chat. I've got another question myself for the panelists, but wanted to give you a heads up to please put your questions in, and then I'll ask them as we're wrapping up the hour. So one more question to all the panelists from my end is just resources. So if someone's curious about this and wants to learn more about the bio-based economy, or your own solutions as well, do y'all have any resources that you would recommend people check out to learn more? So Nuha, kick it off with you again.
For sure. So we always release really great white papers, blogs about biomaterials and composting and the overall plastic waste crisis. So definitely check our platform out. But I'd say that we also rely on resources and information from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which I think we already mentioned here. So that's a really great platform to go to learn if you're new to the space or continue to stay in the loop.
Awesome, thank you. And Cliff, I'll head to you next.
Sure, yeah. I would also recommend checking out our website for resources, bpiworld.org. But in addition to that, I'm a big fan of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation as well. A lot of great resources there. But as well, I would recommend looking at resources issued by the U.S. Composting Council. They're another nonprofit that's highly engaged in the space that we collaborate with on often.
And I think Ellen MacArthur Foundation even has free courses that people can take to learn more about designing for circularity. So plug for that as well. Katie, wrapping with you, any resources that you recommend?
Definitely. Yeah, so a counterpart to EMF or Ellen MacArthur Foundation is an amazing group out of the Netherlands called Circle Economy. They produced the Circularity Gap Report, and it's a lot more focused on cities and infrastructure globally, but they are incredible partners, produce incredible research, and I would say, right up there with Ellen MacArthur. In the US, the Biomade Institute and the Remade Institute are incredible. When we're talking about deep scientific research and how to translate some of that research, and there's a lot of collaboration with the White House, OSTP, and the Department of Energy. So, but they do a lot of publications, and I think that's probably the last one, because one of our advisors, and someone who helped us found the fund, Bill McDonough. So the Cradle to Cradle Institute is something, and Bill has just produced some really incredible work on carbon circularity. So not just mitigating, but carbon circularity and what that looks like within various markets. And I think that the new resources, but then also just Cradle to Cradle in general and what they're doing at the Institute is great.
Fantastic. Thank you, Katie. And I'll also do a plug for folks to check out y'all's website too. It's wonderful, it's beautiful, and has a lot of great resources as well. So thank you for that. And I'll kick things off with our first question in the chat. And I'll start off with Cliff and Nuha for y'all around just, let's say, compostable scalability. And Cliff, if you want to take it to start, how much scale is possible, for compostables, and, are compostables able to really support solutions for, like, let's say, large and progressive companies like Chipotle? Are we able to really convert to 100% compostable materials and to create easier messaging to its consumers?
Sure. Scalability from that perspective is 100% achievable. We work with a lot of companies just like Chipotle that, have a huge global footprint and are looking to switch their packaging to compostable products. So what we do is, we have a certification process, which is where we could probably support in best case there. That process does take quite a bit of time because you have to do all the lab work required to ensure that the product is compostable. But beyond that, beyond just getting your product certified or your resin manufacturer or producer's products certified to be compostable, we also have a lot of benefits being a nonprofit for our member organizations. And as I mentioned before, one of those things is you can collaborate directly with composters who may or may not accept your compostable materials. You can collaborate with the resin producers as well as municipalities because all of those are members within our nonprofit organization. So it's definitely doable on that end. Again, the difficult part is having those compostable infrastructures. Are there actually going to be a composting facility in your consumer's region that can take the product? That's always the question, right? But of course, we're very familiar in this space on how to navigate that. We know the disclaimers that should be used. So we can definitely support from the certification perspective, as well as connecting with all the other value chain stakeholders.
Thank you. Thank you. And, from the industry perspective, Nuha, would love your thoughts too. What do you think about scalability towards meeting the needs of these types of large customers?
Yeah, I think that, traditionally bioplastics and biomaterials have struggled to scale. And I think that that's part of the reason why we wanted to start Erthos, is trying to build the most scalable bio-based materials for our industry. And so from a material perspective and from the manufacturing side of things, what we've done is we've designed with ultimate compatibility for scale. So really fitting into existing infrastructure, making sure that we can leverage what's already out there instead of having to rely on new tools, new equipment, new systems. And that's the first step in making sure we can really scale to the volumes of brands like Chipotle. And then on the input side, that's the second element. So the fact that we can't always rely on a single source, and we need to be able to diversify the inputs themselves. So just in the past few years, we've been focusing our research efforts on expanding the input database that we can leverage for our formulations of biocomposites and biomaterials. And so that means, staying ahead and trying to leverage inputs like seaweed or mushroom, and making sure that 5 years down the road, when that input does scale, we can incorporate that into our formulations, and also leveraging other inputs that are local. So when we think about scale from a footprint perspective, when we're designing formulations here in North America, we want to be able to use local resources here versus in Asia, and we want to have that flexibility to change inputs. So I think from a materials perspective, we are seeing a lot of other biomaterial companies now take on additional steps in ensuring we're future-proofing kind of that scale aspect of both our manufacturing and our inputs. So we feel ready for what's to come.
Exactly. And to echo your points, from a molded fiber perspective, that scale is already there in terms, there's nothing more visceral than the fact that Chipotle already has molded fiber bases across all of their stores. So I can't emphasize enough that the scale is there. And at least, within our organization and others among our industry, that we are actively servicing customers of that size and caliber to help meet their sustainability needs. So that's really exciting as well. So we have a question from Sabina to you, Nuha. So she wanted to elaborate, to Nuha's point about the importance of having implementation guidelines and roadmaps. Does the executive order include any specific recommendations? That's, I think, in reference to President Biden's recent executive order. And so maybe you and Katie can take that on. And then also, could you also share more generally how plastic bans can be monitored? Are fines levied if businesses continue to offer and use plastics? Would this be similar implementation to New York ban on plastic bags? Appreciate any details you can share.
Katie, do you want to touch on that first, just from the U.S. perspective?
Sure. So the executive order mentioned went through last year, and there are several government agencies right now creating roadmaps. So there's been some capital allocated, and the cool thing is that the Department of Defense is even involved. So that means we're going to see some very serious collaboration, but there is not anything that's been published necessarily on what the exact roadmap will look like. I have it through information that there is a decent budget associated that has been allocated from both on the federal side. What I think the next steps will be, and I'm happy to share with Savannah and the rest of the crew, is as long as I have access to that information. When we see a little bit more coming down the pike, I'm happy to share what we're seeing there.
Yeah, I think that we're waiting to see how it all plays out in a lot of the regions, especially all over the world. I think everyone has different approaches to it, but usually there is some sort of fine or tax associated with that type of product application or the type of resin or material that is being banned. So in Canada, of course, we have 6 items that have been highlighted as a single-use plastic ban, and there's different impacts to each one of those product applications and what solutions are actually allowed or permitted and which ones are not. So it is very dependent on the region, dependent on the type of product, dependent on the type of plastic. So there's obviously a lot of complexities there. I wish it was simple and we could just unify everything. That would make everything a lot easier.
And one thing, Savannah, I'll just hop in and say that part of the executive order, at least around biomanufacturing in the US, is around displacing petroleum-based products. So in the next 20 years, 90%, that's the goal, right? Is to get 90% of, all products that are newly created. So this doesn't actually get into our reuse and recycling component, but I think that's the question of where things play out. And we could certainly use more people active, like the folks on this call, putting pressure, perhaps not pressure, but you know what I mean, making this legislation a reality in terms of the targets that have been set and the high standards to what we can actualize and make real.
Exactly. And as part of that, hopeful for a roadmap that helps couple those solutions with the infrastructure to support them as well. Like, love the momentum, and definitely looking to see more systems-wide approaches to how that'll look like and form to help capture those biomaterials that'll be coming in. So we've got one more question here. So while 100% circular compostable solutions would be the ideal solution, would there still be value in marketing your solutions as better for the environment, even if in the short term, the solutions still end up in landfills? So Nuha, I think you were touching on that earlier. Would you like to elaborate a little bit further around the benefits at the beginning of life?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that that's what's most exciting about this industry, is that we're trying to design solutions that are holistically better. Composting is just one aspect of it. And so I think that it's absolutely the case when we're talking to our partners. Some of our partners value the carbon footprint more than they do the end of life. And so we know that it's important for us to think about how we manufacture and what the overall footprint is. So yes, in the meantime, I think it's important to build better materials overall and ensure that we can actually communicate that through our LCA reports, through our end-of-life testing, through the overall material source. Because ultimately, yes, it's displacing petroleum-based products in our landfill, and that's what's really important to always remember.
Yeah, a story I often say is that, it's very much akin to electric vehicles, right? And with any of these sustainable solutions, they are successful within systems. That's something that we were talking about at the beginning of this call, that Cliff was touching on, that each one of these value chain partners is critical in the overall success of that system, but each are important and valuable in and of themselves too. So if you think about electric vehicles, electrification is a critical tool in our toolbox towards overall carbon reduction and climate action. But here in Georgia, right, oftentimes when EVs were first hitting the roads and in our market, they were plugging into coal. Well, you certainly don't want to, gosh, I hate this term, but throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? You don't want to stop the momentum of this progress just because of that one element. Instead, as more and more EVs flooded the market, there was actually a massive push that led to some incredibly friendly clean energy policies across the state of Georgia that we are now seeing and reaping the benefits from today, especially among EV drivers that can now drive clean. So you can see the same thing with compostables, that they are a critical solution in and of themselves from field to fork to field, and start off with renewable resources rather than depending upon petroleum. And then from there, we're continuing to make massive strides towards growing that composting infrastructure to support it. So thanks again for that thoughtful question. Are there any other questions that the attendees might have for our lovely panelists? Looks like I'm not seeing any jump out, so I think we will begin to wrap up. How can we reach out? So if folks want to share, and maybe, or if your team's on, share y'all's websites so folks can learn more. If you want to put your websites in the chat so folks can learn more about you. I'll use this time to just say thank you. Thanks to all of you for joining. Really, really appreciate everybody's time and appreciated this opportunity to dive into a topic that I think we will continue to see more and more about this shift towards a regenerative bio-based economy that's leaning into renewable resources as a critical tool towards climate action and just smarter systems overall. So each of you are leaders in this field, and so just thank you all for your perspective that you shared today, and just hope to continue these types of conversations moving forward. So thanks all. Appreciate the time.
Thank you, Savannah.
Everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good one.